I would say the best advice that I was given is have the wisdom to know when to respond versus react. And the difference being is that with responding, we are in control of ourselves. We're not allowing anyone else to make us feel bad about ourselves or where we blow up at someone because we feel totally out of control. And so it felt really empowering to know the difference of responding versus reacting.
I think that's such a great piece of advice. And for the women listening today to say, how do I react? Like, am I reacting or am I responding? Right. And I think a lot of times we do react. And I see that within myself as well. Right. It's that if there's a moment where things don't go my way, instead of really taking it in and thinking, okay, how am I going to respond to this? There's an instant reaction. And we really do need to take the time and kind of take that all in and think about how we want to move forward in the world.
Welcome to Her Unshakable Confidence with dynamic mother-daughter duo Simone and Olivia Knego, where they discuss the secrets of transformation and how to build bold confidence and unwavering resilience. From intimate conversations with inspiring guests to sharing their personal journeys of triumph and challenge, Simone and Olivia create a supportive space where every woman is encouraged to rise above her fears and love the woman in the mirror. Tune into Her Unshakable Confidence and join this special journey of connection and growth. It's like catching up with old friends who inspire you to be bravely and uniquely you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Her Unshakable Confidence. I'm Simone Knego.
And I'm Olivia Knego.
And today we have a special guest with us. Berni Slowey is a dynamic storyteller, award-winning filmmaker, and the inspiring host of the acclaimed Divine Journeys podcast. Berni's profound work centers on guiding individuals through transformative paths of healing, self-discovery, and personal growth. Her award-winning documentary, Berni's Journey, premiered on PBS and has garnered accolades such as the Award of Merit at the Indie Fest and the prestigious Telly Award. With a rich background in creating powerful narratives that resonate deeply with audiences, Berni offers a unique blend of wisdom, compassion, and practical insights. Her compelling storytelling and heartfelt approach make her an exceptional guest for podcasts seeking to inspire and empower their listeners. That's exactly why we have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm thrilled. Thank you both, Simone and Olivia. I'm excited to be here and to see how our conversation unfolds.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that little bio that I read, you actually have more than one podcast. You have two podcasts, right? So why don't we just start there before we tell our story? Because I was like, oh, wait, there's two podcasts. I only read about one of them. So tell us about your podcast and then we'll, yeah.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. My first podcast I started was Interprosecco, and Prosecco is the sparkling wine of Italy, and it happens to be my favorite sound every time the bottle pops. Well, the bottle popped a lot when I was with my girlfriends raising our children together so that we shared many wonderful conversations about parenting, but just life in general. And as the kids got older, it felt like, wow, thank God we got together. We used to have these Friday afternoon clubs and they always involved Prosecco. And I feel like Prosecco is a little bit of a truth serum. And so I wanted to play off of that as my husband and I became empty nesters, that we weren't involving our children's conversations as much as turning the page of our next chapter as empty nesters. And what did that mean to put that spotlight back on us? And so that's why I wanted to create Interprosecco, because with the message in the bottle of what really is empty nesting, or empty nester syndrome. And really it was for empowerment of mothers to understand that as much as we have given to our family, whatever sacrifices we've made in our careers for our children, that it was time to go ahead and really embrace that celebration for that next chapter in life. And I always use the term re-inspirement because I think we're always evolving and growing. And so that was more to celebrate femininity and motherhood. And then I felt as though after my journey of filmmaking, I wanted to return back to that theme of journeys. And so I created a second podcast called Divine Journeys. And really, that is about slowly uncovering what that means for each of us, because we're all on a different path. We all have our individual beliefs. And so, wanting to introduce what helped me through my filmmaking journey, as well as when I left my corporate career. And that was just introducing more of a spiritual education around the different modalities and what it meant, not just from a psychological perspective, from an emotional and physical, mental, heart-based perspective.
So I'm really excited to listen to both of them. And I think the empty nester thing, I mean, for me, it's going to be in less than 2 years. And it's real because I have spent so much of my life raising children. And that's why I actually do all the things that I do now, because I wanted to find myself before my kids left the house, right? I wanted to figure out me and what I wanted before they were gone, because sometimes you get to the point where they leave and you're like, what do I do now? And so that's why I'm excited to listen to it, but also I can totally connect with it. So,
Well, I think, Mom, that one time, I guess a year ago, I went out with you and your friends for lunch. And I just said something that is like stuck with me is like, yeah, our conversations used to be all about our kids. And now they're all about our aches and our pains.
it's so true. It's so true. It's
And
amazing when we get older.
might I add the menopause? That also is a factor as we're getting older and very real, as much as the emotions of life changing. And the thing about Divine Journeys too is that I really saw that there was correlation in what I was introducing a lot of modalities that people may not have really understood, like the basis of astrology, numerology. So that anything that can help us kind of understand what our pathway is, because when we start to separate ourselves a little bit from our kids, cutting the umbilical cord is hard. That is something we would never think that, we would look forward to the day when our kids are successfully on their own. But there's also that element of like that sadness, because I think we lose ourselves. When we have children, or even just in career, our identity is really based off of what our title is and what we do, instead of focusing on who we are being, and are we truly being authentic, expressing ourselves with our talents and serving that through our life purpose. That's why I loved your Unshakable Confidence podcast.
Thank you. It's so true that and Liv, you don't know this yet because you're you're in school and you haven't had kids, but you a lot of times I think, and it's a fail of our system, not our system, but the way we do things, is that we do tend to become our title, right? And it's such a limiting thing, because we are way more than that, but it's just something kind of that society has kind of paved that way for us. And we need to kind of rethink that as we move forward.
With the Divine Journeys, also, one element I didn't talk about as far as the podcast itself is that the tagline for the podcast is "Hit for the Soul." So we all know, if you've done HIT, the high intensity interval training, and it's usually less than 30 minutes. And I modeled my podcast after that because of the content. I wanted people to feel like they were listening to some kind of educational forum, right? So, but with an element of that spirituality, that HIT stands for healing, intuition, intention, and transformation. And it really falls in line with the 4 levels of consciousness. And so if you haven't heard of those 4 different levels, there's unconscious incompetence. We don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. Then you have the conscious incompetence. Well, I know that I don't know this. Mm-hmm. And then with the unconscious competence, the conscious competence of learning what it is that we want to know, right? We're at that point. And I think that's a little bit of that, what we were talking about as far as even the empty nester, or when we have major life changes like death, divorce, disease, debt, dependency, disaster, when those things hit us as a cosmic 2x4 in life, what helps us to get to that degree of all those different consciousnesses, that we get to that unconscious competence where we're in a state of flow. And with HIT, that's why I wanted to take the healing of H, the intuition, to understand that this becomes an inner journey to discovery, so that with the intention that we set, it's not just about manifestation, it's about how we are seeing our life and expressing gratitude for everything we already have and what we already are today, for who we want to become and what we want to bring into our lives. And then that's when transformation can truly happen. And I think what you're doing as far as the transformation piece is that we take what we learn and we share it with others.
I love that. And I think that is so important, which actually kind of leads me into my next question, because something big that you shared with others is your journey. And I want to hear about maybe let's start a little bit with your story before we get to the filmmaking piece of it. So you have an amazing story. You have a fascinating story. And I would love to give the woman out there that's listening just something completely different than she's expecting right now. And I think that's what your story does.
All right. So I will begin with where I was born, in Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, my mother was this maiden that met my American GI father. They fell in love. And with the turmoil of war, my father had returned home, and my mother and I had evacuated just days before Saigon fell. Now, before Saigon fell, and it was, my mother had always told us it was about 2 weeks beforehand that I recall us, me and some other children, that were playing through the helicopters and the sounds of war. And for us, it was just, well, we're just outside playing, being kids. In that moment, there was a little girl that had disappeared, and I didn't understand what had happened. But my aunt, who was watching us, came down the stairs of the apartment building where we were playing in front of, and she was very upset with me. And I didn't understand why, but I carried that guilt because the way that she had expressed this anger, and then realizing that this little girl went missing, I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew it was something big. Fast forward, my mother and I evacuate, and I remember seeing a picture that she was looking at, and she started to cry. Never understanding who this little girl was, she explained to me that it was my cousin. It made sense because the aunt was watching us. We never spoke of this little girl until 1995, when I returned to Vietnam with my mother, and she was insistent that I go with her. And being in Vietnam, for me, it was this, gosh, I've always wanted just to assimilate to the American culture. I don't know anything about the Vietnamese culture. And so when I was integrating with my family again, to learn that as they were talking about this little girl again in this picture, in this photo, everyone's starting to cry. And I'm asking, Mom, is my aunt, is that her daughter, the girl that went missing? And she said, no, that is your sister. I couldn't even express how shocking it was, not only to have the feeling of this guilt, that this somehow I was supposed to be watching this little girl. And mind you, I was 4 years old.
I was going to say, you're 4 years old. I mean,
4 years old, not understanding again what's going on. This little girl, apparently she was 2 years old when she disappeared. So having this reality set in just even settled more of this guilt and shame that I had, but wondering why hadn't we ever talked about this little girl? Well, my mother had explained that it was just a difficult time, and she didn't know if she even wanted to leave Vietnam, but she was also afraid of what was going to happen if she hadn't left. And so call it a Sophie's moment. If you've ever seen the movie Sophie's Choice, Meryl Streep's character has to choose in that very moment, do I choose my son or my daughter to give up? In this case, do I choose to stay in Vietnam, my homeland, and find my daughter that went missing? Or do I just take this leap of faith and go and meet up with my daughter's father and start a whole new life? And I can't even imagine trying to make that decision. But it definitely shaped who I was. And therefore, whatever had happened in the United States, my character was based off of, gosh, I just want so badly to be accepted, because at home, I didn't feel that I was accepted. There was this underscore of potentially being, I felt like, why doesn't my mother love me? And I think because she had made a decision to leave, she was projecting onto me her own self-worth and what little she felt she had at the time. But I didn't understand that. So I went on to really looking for external validation and wanting to achieve so badly, because I just wanted those accolades to give me a sense of, well, I have purpose in my life. I'm here for a reason, right? And so dealing with a lot of prejudices from the Vietnam War. And it wasn't until when it was more like high school where I felt that I would be able to be my own person, because of the other thing that happened while I was young is that my family, because the Vietnam War was so unpopular, we moved to Iran. And this was during the anti-Shah revolution. And if you remember the 444 days of the hostage situation, the hostage crisis, well, we were right in the middle of it as we were in Iran, trying to escape all of the negativity of the Vietnam War, just going right into a whole nother war-torn country. So again, just feeling like no sense of self and stability. And so coming home to the US from Iran was like having to start all over again. And so that's what drew this like sense of, I really want to be able to achieve so that people would accept me. So high school was the time frame that I felt like, wow, I'm really growing into my own. I know that this is where I'm good. I'm good at sports. I was a decent student, but I loved making friends who were more accepting of me. And so after everyone graduated, we kind of all went on our own paths, and I started working in the banking career. And I was also going to school and going to college and just putting myself through college as I was also climbing the ladder in the financial arena. And so after 20 years in the financial arena, it was 2008 when there was the mortgage crisis, and we were in a pretty toxic work environment. And it just felt like after 20 years, and that I'd had my third miscarriage, I felt like this kind of stress and this toll, that this American dream that I wanted to achieve so badly, it was turning into a nightmare. So from there, I decided that it was time to leave my 20-year career. But in the midst of the recession, there was not a lot of job opportunities. And so that's when the identity crisis really, and I was just lost and not feeling that I had any sense of worth. And I'm thinking, my gosh, here I understand what my mother was going through. Because when you give up something, you give up your life, you give up your career. And there's that moment where you just wonder, like, who am I anymore? What am I doing? Where am I going?
Yeah, I think it's so true of so many women. I mean, still today, I think it's so true that we fall off of off this path, and it's hard to recoup.
And the recouping is something that, unless you have a great network of friends, hence why the Prosecco,
Yeah.
that I realized that as much of a front I was putting for most of my career, I really noticed that things had changed after I left, because the fact is that I wanted to always appear as though nothing was wrong, that everything was perfect in my life. Realizing this perfectionism, which is never attainable. There's no level of perfection. There's always, like yoga, we're always practicing, right?
Right.
Every day we're practicing life.
Perfection does not exist.
No, and to understand that early on, I think is also very relevant for those young girls out there that are always looking at social media and trying to aspire to something that isn't. And because the filters, just remember that filters can make us all look really good. But
Mm-hmm.
what had helped me is once I went into this film project, which I'll talk a little more about, it wasn't until then where I really felt this humility that I was humbled by this successful career where I left, where it was very unceremonial. My boss was harassing, and I had just lost three babies through the three miscarriages, and I couldn't find a job because it was the worst time in my career to ever try to make a change with the economic collapse. So the perfect storm is really when I felt like I needed to find something that is not outside of myself, but something more of turning inward and discovering who I was again.
And I think this is so important for anyone listening, is that it's such an important piece to really look inward. And
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times, I mean, Olivia and I were talking about this earlier, that we we look for that external validation, but that's not what is really going to keep us in the long run, right? That's a temporary thing. And sure, it's great getting compliments, but it's that internal piece that we're constantly working, we're constantly practicing, as you said. And I think that is what is crucial to move forward.
So well said, Simone, because it's also, I think, for our daughters,
Mm,
that we're in an era right now where there's a lot of confusion. And
Mm-hmm.
so, more importantly, always to understand, and that's where the hit for the soul kind of comes in as far as that inward journey that is required of all of us, but we don't necessarily understand that until the wisdom of the ages, right? So, and I would also say, though, that Olivia, people your age, my gosh, my son is your age. I learn more from him and his perspective in life.
Mm-hmm.
That is has been Jade. I mean, he's had his own, challenges, whatever trauma he's had to overcome. But viewing it from this era, I think there is this sense of hope that your generation is going to be able to learn a lot faster.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I think that we are less less obsessed with the idea of how we look versus what we know. And I think the time that a lot of previous generations spent on just like coming off as perfect, we spend on learning, acknowledging the fact that we won't be perfect.
And I think of when my mother had to choose because of her decision, there was generational trauma that she experienced from her family that then the way that she mothered, I would even argue didn't mother,
mhm.
that caused, such a, disruption. There's dysfunction in the family. And so I think it requires a huge amount of consciousness to be able to step out of that dysfunction and say, I'm going to do it different. And I think that's what really is the segue into why I did this movie project.
And there's
Mhm.
more to the story too, right? I mean, so is
Oh,
that part of the
yes.
project? Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, there's more, guys. There's more.
Well, in this, this desire to understand life more, like what is the meaning of life? Why am I here? Why did I have this experience with this corporate career that ended so abruptly, and that the 2 years that I spent actually figuring out, like I was on this spiritual path. I was just so hungry for understanding what it means to be who I'm supposed to be. And so I worked with different spiritual teachers, and one in particular who had said that once I had my first miscarriage, we kept in touch, and he helped me with some learning, I'll say, that as far as what are the different, I ams, learning about how to use your intuition, And so the intuition that hit me was I should do a movie about this because I wanted to actually a TV show that would take people to venerated places and understand what was their spiritual significance. And then I thought, well, I only have a banking background. I have the financial background in corporate, but I have no filmmaking experience. And so I thought I would do this documentary as a way to get my foot in the door. And I'll tell you that once I made that decision, and I would call people who have made movies, I was talking to people who were in the TV industry just to understand what I needed to prepare for. So the day that I got a call from this teacher, the spiritual teacher who invited me to go to India, because he said there's people coming from the North American speakers that are going to India to talk about spirituality. And because of my finance side, I said, well, I need something more than just spirituality. I need to understand that what's the science behind spirituality. And so he said, well, the conference is the science of spirituality. So I thought, all right, things are starting to fall into place. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I said yes to it. And then within 3 months from saying hello or to saying, yes, hello, I'm going to do this to, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? I put everything on a credit card and just put together as much information from people and studying the documentaries being done and leaving in December of 2011 for 20 days over Christmas, leaving my young family at home to go on this filmmaking journey. And when I got there, the speakers were wonderful, but it was not what I was expecting from the conference. And there was all these things that were just falling apart. And so I'm nervous because I know my husband's freaking out about me putting everything on a credit card. And also that I don't know anything about filmmaking.
Slight little issue there, right? I mean, just a little bump there. Yeah.
But I knew enough that I knew that I needed to get people around me, surrounding me. But so I had a producer who introduced me to a product or production manager who could get me film crew while I was in India, which was one of the best choices I ever made was to hire locally because they knew what to who to talk with in case we needed to film anywhere. And it was also realizing that as I was trying to uphold this perfectionism that I knew what I was doing, that inside I was just panicking and my anxiety was taking over. So after the conference, we're heading to the second portion of our trip, which was really to discover India with the speakers. We were doing our vacation portion of it. So I wanted to get their background story and to be able to share with others as far as, what brought them into spirituality. The day that we went to the Taj Mahal, we actually had we pulled over on one of those pit stops, and they had dancing monkeys there. And I had envisioned that if I were to ever see a cobra, I was probably going to just have a panic attack. And mind you, I'm already having this panic attack because I feel like this project is failing. And my worst fear is failing, right? Because I don't want anybody to see that I am not perfect. So I'm with spiritual teachers and they can see that I'm actually having my meltdown. And they're, of course, like, well, what's the big deal? And I'm like, oh no, I see a cobra. That's it. It's coming after me. And so one of the spiritual teachers, of course, Jennifer Huff, she's like, well, it's just another creature of God. There's no reason to be afraid of it. So she starts to ask me all these questions about, what is it that I'm really afraid of? Is it because I'm going to be bitten by the snake? Am I going to be bitten by the cobra and die? And this is the poignant moment for me that changed everything on the production and probably changed everything from my perspective on my life. When she'd asked, are you afraid of dying? And my response was, I'm not afraid of dying so much as I'm afraid that I will have died before I had fully lived.
Yeah, I think that's a fear for a lot of people, right? I mean, and that's why it's so important that we embrace every moment, because I think a lot of times that we just kind of go through our lives, point A to point B, and not really understanding all of the moments in between are what the journey is the important part. It's not the destination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I had that sense of fear about the cobra, what I didn't realize is that at the time, that cobra was probably there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And why we made that pit stop and that day, because later that night, when I was looking at all the footage, here I was thinking that that cobra was coming after me. You know, I've got the snake charmer in the basket, you know, brings out the cobra, and my cameraman's actually taking footage of the cobra, and that's why I was thinking, my gosh, my cameraman's going to get bitten. Everybody's going to get bitten. We're all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the insanity of fear, right? It's irrational.
Mm-hmm.
And so we exasperate the fear, and until I actually watched the footage of the cameraman catching the cobra scene, I realized that that cobra actually was not coming after me. In fact, the cobra was trying to get away. And watching it from a different lens, because I was able to watch it safely behind the lens of the camera, that cobra was trying to escape, and my fear of the cobra turned to compassion, because that cobra was really a mirror of what I was feeling. That cobra was just trying to get away. It was no longer its powerful self. It would just be put right back into that basket and was caged. It was not its true, powerful, magnificent self.
And that's all about perspective, right? I mean, we think
Absolutely.
oftentimes about that when we see things from a different lens, in a different light, like that perspective changes everything. So I'm hearing these stories and I'm thinking, okay, let's talk a little bit about confidence here, because obviously confidence has to play into this. So what does confidence mean to you, and how, and when you're thinking about this situation where, and do you have a fear of snakes, or was it just that particular moment where, because my mom is like
Oh my
terrified
God,
of snakes,
like ridiculously terrified of snakes.
Oh yeah.
like
I'm
she
with
won't
your
go
sister.
into a pet, she won't go into a pet store if there are snakes in the pet store. You know, back when we were little, at least. I mean, trust me, she's not going to pet stores these days. But when we were little, and of course, my sister and I used to love to catch snakes. So, anyways, go back to the confidence piece. So,
Well, the confidence piece in that moment that it changed everything was that I realized that the story wasn't about the speakers. The story was actually I had to have the confidence to say that I can be the protagonist of this story. I can be the star of this story. And that's what happened. That instead of the journey of the spiritual teachers in India, it became my story of being vulnerable and sharing my experience through all the challenges of life. And that's why it became Bernie's journey. And it was like Alice in Wonderland, that it was definitely going down this rabbit hole and being confident not only to get in front of the camera, but then when you get home, they say that, you know, what you do in post-production is even more important, because how are you going to tell the story? And so then this became this whole, you know, how are we going to edit? Am I comfortable sharing my vulnerable side that I didn't want anybody to see? And not only that, but being able to relate with the other spiritual teachers and how they were incorporating their gifts of their talents to be able to walk me through my issues. And so after coming home and being able to finish Bernie's journey and it premiered, that's when I realized that my desire then was to be able to get in front of people and also helping others on their personal journeys. And that's when I created the retreats business, Burning Journeys, and how others are, you know, whenever they're going through life transitions or life crisis, to be able to also have that time, that just to be able to have the focus, the spotlight on them again. Because the opportunity that I also had that I loved was being able to have a TED Talk and really identifying there were 4 things that came from the filmmaking experience. And that confidence is definitely something that comes as a result. And what I was saying earlier about the 4 stages of consciousness, and you said it, Simone, the first thing that I learned from this filmmaking experience was that we have to reframe our perspective. Because are we the victim or are we the victor? When everything was falling apart, actually everything was falling into place. What if I had that moment with the cobra? I thought that the story was about everybody else. It could never be about me. No way. And then when we're having to come home and tell the story, that my narrative in my life was usually about how I was the victim. But now seeing it through a different lens, I could change that narrative and actually rewrite the script of my life. And in writing the script for Berni's journey and being able to feel that that vulnerability was absolutely necessary, and that took a lot of confidence. Because then in also being in the role of director, the third thing I would say is that we're redirecting our life all the time. We're in the director chair. And what does a director do? Calls action. So when do we take action? When do we have the confidence to take action? Also, I would also say, though, it's really equally important to know when to surrender to the process and the flow, because there might be something even better that we didn't even imagine, as like that cobra moment. And I think the most important thing that I didn't even see this when I did the TED Talk. We go through reframing our perspective. We rewrite our script. We redirect our life. But many of us never reclaim our star power. That is so essential to walking the talk. And when we're able to then share with others and be vulnerable, there's a connection there that's all about our inner journey coming out and expressing ourselves. As I said before, I think that's what people really want. And if we could just identify that the life purpose that we have is to be our authentic selves, is to show it and share our talents, and to express ourselves through our whatever our talents are, that is our life purpose. And that's what creating joy and being excited in the moment is all about, is being able to manifest what we want through the joy of being ourselves.
So we've heard a lot about your story, which is honestly just incredible. Throughout your life, what do you think is the hardest thing that you've done?
On a personal basis or a professional basis?
Either.
Yeah, either. I mean, I think that it's always interesting to hear what each person finds to be the hardest thing they've done. So obviously there is a difference between personal and professional. So let's say personal. Let's say in your personal life, what's the hardest thing you've ever done?
The hardest thing I did personally is to really let go of when I had my third miscarriage. It was difficult as a woman to not blame myself. And so going through the first one and then the second one and the third one was really difficult. And to come out the other side of it and really having a lot of self-forgiveness and wondering, like, what could I have done differently? Should I have left my career sooner? So that on a personal basis, I think that was the hardest thing to overcome.
And the reason we always ask this question, and it's become kind of like a defining piece of the podcast, is that I think it's so important for a woman out there listening to understand that she is not alone, right? We all struggle. There is always something that we're going through. And when we're able to share that with other people, I definitely feel like it makes our journey that much, I don't want to say easier, but it really strengthens our belief in ourselves, understanding that, oh, it's not our fault, or, we're not the only one that this happened to, and those kinds of things. So that's why we always feel like we should bring that into a conversation so that women out there understand that we're all in this together. We are not alone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then I would say from a professional level, being able to finish a film project for the first time, that was really challenging. That took I would say 4 years to get it out and premiered. And like I said, to be vulnerable. And what has happened as a result, I mean, changed my family's life, changed the trajectory of my career. I feel also as a result of being able to, those things that are hard to do, it really also opens up the door to so many more possibilities and, quite honestly, miracles. Because after I did the movie, then the TED Talk, that in 2019, when I received a call because a cousin had received an email from a woman who was looking for her family, that had just learned that she was adopted. And when she emailed, in her email, she said, I was lost on the streets of Saigon when I was 2 years old. Mm. And my cousin, who had heard the story, reached out and said, I think something special is happening right now. Shared the contact information of this woman. And when we connected, I just knew that that woman was my missing sister. Mm. And sure enough, it was. We've done all of the DNA testing and what a journey that has been, right? Because the journey never ends. There's always another thing that comes into our lives that gives us an opportunity to end something, which I think change is so healthy and necessary, so that when we have change and life transition, it really is opening the door for other opportunities. And these coincidences, which I think God just says, I wanted to remain anonymous, that these miracles are happening all the time. And so the fact that my sister is now back into our lives, and I'm just continuing to tell that story.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful story. I remember you telling me it the first time I heard it, I thought, wow, like, what is the chance? I mean, I know now with like the different testing you can do, 23andMe and that kind of stuff, but the chance that you find someone that you thought was just, you didn't even know what happened, right? And now to be able to connect those dots in your story, I think is so huge.
And what we're also learning as far as how the DNA is very much, it can work for us, and what it's doing, the technology, what it's doing for other families, whether it's crimes that are unsolved for many years, and then they now can trace back to DNA, that again, it's looking at life through a different lens, that we can start over or renew. And so I know that, Olivia, when you were asking about like what's the hardest thing, I think that's just it, is a lot of people don't want to go through change because change is comfortable, but then we don't grow. Our souls were here to grow. We are asking for transformation. It's just so many of us are like too afraid to take that initial step.
And I think taking that step, right? I think that's a big part of building your confidence, is that when we just sit there and not do these other things, right? We're not growing at all. And when we're willing to move forward, that builds our confidence because we realize what we're capable of. And that's what with Live, we talk about it all the time, that do the things that you think you can't. Do the hard things. Like, really, if you want something, go out there and do it, and don't let fear stop you from it.
Right. Oh, I so agree. Like, the thing that holds us back so much is the fear. And I think that turning that fear into revered, so that, seeing that fear, if we fail, it's only failure if we don't learn from it, right? Again, changing that, flipping the script, looking through a different lens, and also with the question as far as like, what is truly confidence? And I think the confidence is doing something, not only just pushing through the fear and doing it anyway. I think it's important that we do things repetitively, so that that confidence comes from, hey, I knew that I had never made a movie, but I had skills that I knew that I could transfer. And even though it was difficult, I mean, the learning process, and it took longer, but the reward after. And that's the thing, is that taking that, never doing a podcast before, and, just doing it anyway. And I think there's an element of confidence versus self-esteem, because I think confidence is something how we show up in the world ultimately. That self-esteem, though, that little girl that was wondering why, holding all this shame and guilt, never feeling worthy, though, I think is something that is also important to correlate with confidence, because self-esteem, I think, is a more of an inner value that we place on our worth. And maybe confidence is something that we show up and we can do it, but are we feeling good about ourselves? And I guess I liken it to, somebody who's going to train for Mount Evans, and you're training, knowing that you can reach the top because you've done it so many times or whatever the case may be. But that self-esteem, if it's healthy, says, I know that I can climb that mountain. I just don't need to.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I just need to be the best version of myself, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, I think that self-esteem is a big part of
Mm-hmm.
confidence. I feel like there's a lot of things connected with self-worth and self-esteem and self-love, all of these things. I mean, in my opinion, they all work together to build confidence, because for me, I believe that confidence is built from the inside out. It's not how loud you are in the room. It's none of those things. It's being able to be really comfortable with yourself, no matter who you're with, where you are. And so I always feel like all of that kind of is intertwined into building true confidence. Now,
Yep.
I mean, you see a lot of people that have their own version of it, but that's really how I see it.
Yeah. So wrapping up, I guess our last question is, what's the best advice a woman in your life gave you?
Oh boy, there's been a lot of great advice. I would say that the best advice that I would share has something to do with the self-esteem a little bit and how we show up with confidence. So in that Cobra moment, I would say the best advice that I was given is have the wisdom to know when to respond versus react.
Mm.
And the difference being is that with responding, we are in control of ourselves. We're not allowing anyone else to make us feel bad about ourselves, or where we blow up at someone because we feel totally out of control. And so it felt really empowering to know the difference of responding versus reacting.
I think that's such a great piece of advice. And for the women listening today to say, how do I react? Like, am I reacting or am I responding? Right. And I think a lot of times we do react. And I see that within myself as well. Right. It's that if there's a moment where things don't go my way, instead of really taking it in and thinking, okay, how am I going to respond to this? There's an instant reaction. And
Mm-hmm.
we really do need to take the time and kind of take that all in and think about how we want to move forward in the world.
Yes, and that's part of I think, the consciousness journey and those steps that we take to get to that
Mhm.
point of that transformation, and to just accept ourselves, love ourselves, as you said earlier, Simone, because then in doing that, we have that compassion and that grace to allow others to do the same.
Absolutely. So, Liv, it is time for your calendar. Bring it
To
on.
to fear is to be human. To avoid fear is to avoid your own humanity.
Hmm.
Love it.
Yeah. I think that
Mic
fit
drop.
in. Yeah. I feel like that fit in quite well for today, right? And I think there's so much to take away from this episode. I think that you've given so much wisdom, and I really appreciate you being here today. So thank you so much.
Oh, it was my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So where can people find you?
You can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Berni_Slowey. Bernie is without an E. So, quick story, there were two Bernies. One was a male, and myself in middle school, and our typing teacher just took the E off of my name, and I kept it. So Bernie without an E.
Love that.
Yep. So Berni_Slowey. You can also find me on Facebook. I also have a Facebook group called Divine Community. T is with the TEA. And then also BerniSlowey.com. And where you can also find my Divine Journeys podcast, as well as the Interprosecco podcast.
Love it. Thank you. And thank you for listening to us today, for watching us today. And I'm having like a moment right now. Let me tell you, I didn't sleep well last night. And I'm like, okay, what am I saying right now? I'm thinking so many different things. So thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Her Unshakable Confidence. Always remember, you are unshakable. Have a
Bye,
great day.
guys.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Her Unshakable Confidence with Simone and Olivia Knego. We hope this episode has made your day just a little bit brighter and given you the inspiration you need to confidently go about your week. Always remember to be authentically you. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And feel free to connect with them on Instagram at Simone Knego and at Olivia Knego. Till next time.